All right. Thanks. Thanks, Monica, and the entire team for having me. Also, thanks for organizing the event. I know that it's a lot of work, and this includes Monica and the entire team. So my name is Massimo Re Ferrè. I'm part of the AWS team working on generative AI, specifically Amazon Q developer, but I'm not going to talk about products today. I work for AWS, but I'm not going to represent AWS here. What I wanted to do is provide you with a little bit of background about my journey into generative AI, and hopefully you can find something that is inspirational to you. So talking about my experience, I usually start talking about what I've done in the last 30 years, hopefully in a minute, not too much. I started at IBM back in the days, like in the 90s. I never actually worked on the mainframe, but I was working with people next that were working on the mainframe. So I know kind of that environment a little bit. Where I actually started was with this thing called the PC, or personal computer, right? At that time, IBM invented this thing, and they were figuring out what to do with these. So that is where I actually started my IT career. As I started working on more advanced stuff, I started to work on servers based on these x86 or Intel-based architecture, to the point where I moved into this space called virtual machines, right? This is something that I usually talk about, how I got into virtual machine. That was like 2000, actually 2001. I was in the United States for a training, and I got to this IBM laboratory where we were building this gigantic 16 CPUs monster server, and the head of engineering there was telling me, like, we built this thing because we know how to build these massive, capable servers, but nobody wants them, right? So what are people going to do with these gigantic 16 CPU Intel-based server? They all want these, small web server, DNS server, print server. So we're talking to this small company called VMware. There are like 100 people. They build these, hypervisor thing that you put on the host, and then you can carve out virtual machines. And I was looking at these whiteboard session, and I was like, this thing is never going to work. I mean, it's like, you put a hypervisor on top of hardware, and then you start virtual machine. What are you talking about, right? So they gave me this CD. At that time, we used CD to deploy stuff, right? And it was like ESX 1.0. I'm not sure how many of you are into VMware and that technology, but that was very early days for VMware. I got here in Milan, actually. I work here in the local office. I tried it in my lab where I had one of those gigantic server, and I was like, this thing is going to change the world, right? And that is how I got into virtual machines, later on into containers, and every step that I did in my career was defined by these, almost every step I would say, was defined by this aha moment, right? For VM was that story that I was talking about. For containers, it was something similar that got me to think like, oh, there is something here that is going to be very big, right? Another big transition that I did over the last 30 years was this notion of how do you deliver infrastructure, right? I have always worked, in the data center space, so to speak, and cloud was becoming a thing. And so I switched into this cloud thing when I moved to AWS almost 8 years ago. And that is where I work again on containers, on serverless, and then what happened a couple of years ago, I had this other aha moment where I transitioned into generative AI, right? And to me, that aha moment was I was migrating my web server, my local web server, my blog, onto S3, CloudFront, and I needed to do something very specific that require a Lambda at edge function to do that thing. And I was like, I keep hearing about this ChatGPT thing. Everybody's talking about ChatGPT. What the hell is it, right? So let's see if I can get something out of this, right? So I asked ChatGPT, write a landed edge function for CloudFront that strips out www in front of a host name if it exists, right? And this is, I need to do this, and boom, it just spits, a almost 100% working key being almost 100% working clouded edge function that would do exactly that, right? And that was the exact moment that I thought, there is something here, right? There is something here that is very, very interesting that could potentially change the world. And I still maintain that I think that this thing is going to change the world. The other thing that I usually talk about is that if you step back and if you think about how generative AI works and what you can do with generative AI, it's very interesting, right? Because at the very core of generative AI, there is this notion of anticipating what you want to do, right? So if you take, for example, a playground and you start using a large language model, and you just type A, B, C, D without nothing, right? No question or anything. You just type A, B, C, D, and you hit enter. You get like E, F, and then it explains, well, that's kind of the alphabet, right? Because it's at the very core, it's just statistically imagining what you want to type next, right? So I find it kind of very interesting what you can actually build on top of this very core primitive. The other thing that I talk about is like, what I refer to as the 3 phases of generative AI that I've seen, right? So I'm not suggesting that generative AI has these big 3 phases, but if I think back about what I've done in the last 2.5 years, almost, there are 3 very distinct phases. The first one is that when you ask a question about, a generic fact, this was my aha moment, right? So give me like a lambda edge function that does X, Y, Z, for example, right? So you are extracting knowledge from this large language model. The second phase, where I pretty much spend a lot of time, is what I refer to as this knowledge plus, right? So in addition to extract knowledge from what's baked into the large language model, there is a notion of RAG, or augmenting the knowledge that the LLM has with your private data, for example, so that you can start chatting with your private data, for example. The third phase, that is the phase where we're in, which is probably the most interesting one, is this notion of being able to submit a goal to the LLM or to a generative AI system, right? And there are 2 major things that has happened in the last year or so that can make it possible. The first one is that notion of reasoning. So if you think about the LLMs where they have been first announced and released back in, a couple of years ago from ChatGPT and Anthropic, they were more around knowledge, right? So you would ask a thing and you would get back like a fact, right? Either that was baked into the model or it was augmented via RAG or those other techniques. But what you can do today with this model is you can ask them to reason about a problem, right? Not just extracting knowledge, but reason about a problem. The second thing that is happening is the notion of the fact that these LLMs can use tools, right? So it's not just about a discussion that you're having with the LLM. These LLMs can actually act in the physical world, right? You can ask an LLM to edit a file, to read a file, write a file, to call an API, to call the web, and it's really the combination of these 2 things, reasoning and tools, that can make possible this notion of creating agents, right? So this is another thing that is happening that is very important. The other thing that I usually talk about, and if you think about the previous slide, it's about like the deepness of the things that you can do with an LLM, right? So how good is an LLM to do certain things, right? You start from knowledge all the way to being able to reason and act on your behalf. The other dimension that I usually talk about is where does generative AI apply, right? So in our world, right, where can you use these things? Of course, the world of generative AI is very broad, right? It is disrupting potentially a lot of industry, right? We're not going to talk about how generative AI is going to disrupt, like, Hollywood or these sort of things, but it applies to that world as well. So what I'm focusing here is how does generative AI apply to what we usually do on a daily basis, right? So working in IT. So if you think about that, there are three major, buckets, if you will, right? So there is the first bucket that is kind of the user, right? So the user interact with the system, with an application, maybe an application that you build, right? And the way that that user may interact with that application, think about the business user, for example. They may use a SQL-like language to query like an application, right? In order to get all the customers that satisfy a particular profile, they may need to write a query like that the system will respond to with the list of customers that comply to that profile. The second thing, or the second space where this apply is to the builder itself, most likely you, right? The people that are actually building stuff on AWS or wherever, right? So it's the builder that actually writes the code. And the third element is like the code itself, right? So the code is a bunch of instruction, right? Written typically in a programming language, right? So this is where generative AI applies. The first part and the first bucket where it applies is what I refer to as generative AI at consumption time, right? So a lot of people are rushing into building inside the application, the capability for an end user to use generative AI or to use like natural language to interact with the application. So instead of writing like a SQL query that extract the customers that comply with a certain profile, the user will just in English, right, selects all the information from a view and filters it based on the following criteria, blah, 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 right? So this is what I refer to as at consumption time. The second space where it applies is what I refer to as generative AI at development time, right? So this is, if you have used a generative AI coding assistant, Amazon Q Developer, Copilot, Cursor, Windsurf, you name them, Klein, there's so many of them. You are in this space, right? So basically, you, as the builder, use this coding assistant to help you write this code in the system, right? So they use this generative AI assistant to, in some way, leverage that knowledge or capabilities that we have seen before. The third and the last one, which is not spread right now in terms of usage, is this notion of generative AI at runtime, right? So this is about, instead of a system being written in Python, in Java, or in whatever programming language, the system itself is running using a set of English statements, right? There is a very good blog here that was kind of inspirational to me to understand what this space is all about. And that user was actually having a problem that was like a very real problem, like for his business, he needed to figure out if two physical addresses were the same address, right? And if you think about that, if you look at two physical addresses that are written in a very different way, you as a human being with your reasoning capability, can you immediately spot that, yeah, these are the two exact same physical addresses. They're just expressed in a slightly different way in English, right? But they're the same thing, right? Trying to code these knowledge, right, using a programming language is very difficult compared to giving these two physical addresses to an LLM and ask, are these two physical addresses the same address, right? And with high accuracy, you can get a yes or no answer. So he basically built kind of a library that does that. So you just import that library, and you use that library to do those comparisons, for example. So let's talk a little bit more about this particular use case, mostly because this is the area where I work with. So I have the most probably anecdotes, or I have more opinions around where the world is heading. And maybe it's also the one that you're interested in the most. So first of all, where are these coding assistants going, right? I mean, there is no surprise. If you think about the previous slide that we showed in terms of the evolution of what you can do with generative AI and with the LLMs, it's pretty much the same thing, right? Actually, if you think about that, these coding assistants started a little bit before ChatGPT was even a thing, right? So this coding assistant started with this notion of inline coding, right? So you are in the editor writing your program in Python, Java, JavaScript, TypeScript, whatever you use. And as you type, the coding assistant will suggest things to you, right? Oh, because you're typing these, most likely you want to type this next, right? Which is very close to the previous slide that I showed you in terms of A, B, C, D, E, right? It's kind of the same thing, but applied to coding. And then we have this phase where, ChatGPT was older age and people were like, this coding assistant needs to have a chat interface where I can interact with them. I want to ask them questions like, how do I query a DynamoDB table, right, for example, right? And the coding assistant would just spit, okay, this is how you query a DynamoDB table if you're not experienced with DynamoDB. This is how you do it, right? And the first phase, which is pretty much the phase that we're in right now, it's actually intercepting that agentic stuff that we have seen in the previous slide on the right-hand side over there, which is you can submit a goal, right? So instead of asking a question or instead of asking a snippet of code, you can actually ask the assistant a goal, like, for example, the typical or the canonical demo that I usually do is create a new Flask route in a dedicated web page at the following path. This page should be password protected. The page will show a table in a grid format with the 4 restaurants and blah, 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 right? So you're actually, think about this as an issue that you open for a feature request, for example, that you can assign to the coding assistant for the coding assistant to be able to actually build that feature for you, right? And the way that it does it is by reasoning about the things that it needs to do and actually using tools to be able to actually build that feature for you, which means reading file, writing files, executing commands, for example, which is all these, what these coding assistants do. Another typical discussion that I usually have with customers is how do you measure productivity of these tools, right? So this is interesting because as I talk to different customers, I get very different, answers to that. I mean, we can approach this in a serious way, like having a very serious discussion that would take a long time, but we can also tackle this in a funny way, which is what I want to do here, which is there are a bunch of these people that are thinking about these generative AI tools as a mechanism to go home early, right? And you've been surprised to see how many people are suggesting that, right? They're thinking about that, right? And so there was this tweet last year from Astasia saying, heard this week from someone, engineering manager, who have individual contributors using GitHub Copilot. It makes engineering faster, but they don't commit to doing additional work with this extra time. So what is the company really getting for paying for this product, right? And I was like, this is kind of a weird take. And then I talked to a solutions architect colleague in the field working with a customer. And a few weeks later, he was saying they, the customer, see developers wanting to use this tool to complete their existing tasks faster and get off work early. And I was thinking about these things, and I was like, yeah, I mean, job accomplished, right? This is exactly what you want to do. It's on the company to say, yeah, this is a benefit that you get off of work at 2 p.m. instead of staying for until 6 p.m. Or you get additional work to do because now you can be much faster, right? But this is kind of, where you want to be with these tools. But there is definitely like a disconnect between the people on the ground, us, I would say, building actual things where you can actually see the value of these things, and the CXOs, at the top level that are like, yeah, but these tools, I mean, what is in it for me, right? These tools feels to me that, they can take more coffee breaks, right? So there is a little bit of disconnect about this, which I find very interesting. The other thing that obviously I keep hearing is, can you trust this assistant, right? I mean, can you trust the accuracy of what they spit, right, to you? Can you actually use what they say? And the typical thing that I hear is, how can you trust a generative AI assistant? How can you make sure it's not hallucinating? Hallucination is that thing where it just very seriously tell you something that is completely false, right? That's kind of an hallucination. You need to verify every answer and every artifact. And then I think back, because I've been in the industry for 30 years, so history is repeating. And if I think back in 2003, 2004, these were the exact same arguments that people were talking about for virtual machines. I cannot tell you how many times I heard back in the days, how can you trust a virtual machine? How can you make sure the bug is not in the hypervisor? You would need to reproduce your bug on a physical server, right? It's always coming back to managing the risk of what you're getting, right? It's a matter of what is the value that I'm getting out of something, and what is the risk that I'm having by using this, right? So my question usually is, do you trust everything and everyone? Can you trust consultant? Can you trust solution architect? Can you trust me, right? You shouldn't. Actually, as a matter of fact, what I usually say is the very first hallucination that I have ever seen in my life was me with a customer in 2002, 2003. I was working on this physical server in production, right, with VMware on it, production servers, production virtual machines. And there was a customer saying, oh, I get bothered with this yellow bang on the screen of this server. How do I reset that yellow bang that talks about the warning, whatever, right? And there were two buttons, a clear log button and the power off, power recycling, right? And I was like, I think it's the one on the right, but I'm not completely sure. And he was like, okay, let's push it. And 2 minutes later, someone knocked at the door saying, did you do something on the production servers? That was the power recycling button, right? So I was basically hallucinating in that case, right? Can you trust the pipeline? Can you trust the test? If you think about how you build code and how you move that code into production, it's exactly the same thing, right? So you build the code, you open a PR for someone else to look at that code to see if you did something wrong with that code, right? So it's always like a pairing of minds to do these things, right? So at the end of the day, it's about controls and risk mitigation, right? So the other thing that I usually say is that if everything fails all the time, why generative AI shouldn't, right? At the end of the day, it's a matter of taking those risks and taking those into consideration. Very tied to this discussion, I think it's a problem of mindset, right? So if you think that this thing can fail, right? If you think that these things can get things wrong, right? Even many times, right? I see a couple of camps, right? People have usually two very different mindsets. The first bucket is people that say, this is not entirely correct, right? So the answer that I'm getting, the value that I'm getting is not entirely correct. And other people that I think have the right mindset saying, this thing helped me save time, right? And the way that I usually talk about this is by an example of, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar about this public benchmark. It's called SWE bench. And basically what this benchmark does is it benchmarks how accurate code assistants are to close GitHub issues, right? So the whole benchmark is, I'm giving you like 1,000 of GitHub issues of real Python project. How many of these issues can you close, Mr. Coding Assistant, right? If you take the full version of the benchmark, usually there is a 20% success rate to close those issues, meaning that out of 10 issues, a coding assistant usually can close 2 of them. Okay? So there are 2 ways to, to reason about this. The first one is, it's wrong 80% of the times, right? So making fun of it, right? It's bad, right? Which maybe it is. But then there is someone else taking a different approach saying, oh, I can take all Fridays off from now to retirement. 20% means that I can work 4 days instead of 5, right? So did it help me, or is it just wrong? It's probably both, right? But it depends on how you see the glass being half full or half empty, or 20% full or 80% empty. And the final question, right? Are these things going to replace us, right? This is the most interesting question that I usually get, right? If they are so good, and if they are improving so fast, are they going to replace us in the end? Which is kind of a fair question. And I like how this user put it on Twitter. Like, I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so that I can do art and writing. Not for the AI to do my art and writing so that I can do my laundry and dishes, right? And if you think about that, it's like the exact notion of removing the undifferentiated heavy lifting that we have been doing for so long, right? It's about extracting what you don't want to do as a builder so that you can focus on the stuff that can actually be useful, right? So the way, as I was thinking about this, the way that I try to communicate this is through these, what I call this framework for generative AI adoption. So if you are a developer, right, you may have a level of skills on a particular topic, right? And your level of skills may vary depending on what you're working on. Maybe you're a super expert on Java, so you would fall here, right, on this spectrum, high-level knowledge, right? But maybe tomorrow someone is asking you to do a project in Rust, and you're bad at Rust. I'm just picking on you, but I have no idea. But you may be here, right? So this varies on the task at hand, right? What you are actually going to do. And then there is like the capability of a generative AI assistant, right? So low task complexity, high task complexity, right? And you may be here, and the fact here is that on the right-hand side, you're out of control, right? So think about that. If you don't know beyond these, when the generative AI assistant suggests something that sits here, you're out of control because you cannot really say, is this right or wrong, right? Am I saving time, or am I just getting something that send me down a rat hole that I'm never going to get out of, right? Whereas here, you are in control. You can say, oh, that thing is wrong, right? Or that thing is right. The other thing is that as you push on the left-hand side, you have low return, right? Because, if you ask things that are so simple, you better off, just writing it, right, in the editor. And on this high-end side, it's high return, right? The highest return that you can think of is you can ask a generative AI assistant, write me a brand new CRM because I want to compete with SAP, right? That's very high return, I would say. probably, never going to happen, at least until I retire. Okay? So you probably want to use these assistants in these two spaces, right? What I call the boost zone. So you're still in control, you know what it is doing, but you have a reasonably high return on what you're trying to do. But there is also this learning zone, right? You're slightly out of your comfort zone or knowledge zone, but it's a great tool to learn new things that you can quickly check on, right? And you used to read blogs, you used to use YouTube. This is just another method to learn stuff, literally. Okay? So you do not want to go all the way here in what I call the danger zone because you're very out of control. But you also don't want to do here because, the return is so low, right? So you probably want to be in this area here. So I built this mid last year, right? And I thought, okay, you don't want to be in this danger zone, right? Because you're getting out of control of your code base, right? And then this thing came out, right? A few weeks ago, Andrej Karpathy just, coined this term of vibe coding, right? And if you don't know what vibe coding is this notion of completely get lost in what the generative AI assistant is doing, right? It's basically you interacting with the assistant in English, letting the assistant do the stuff on your behalf, right? And never go and check what it is doing, right? So that's kind of the notion of vibe coding. It has a negative sentiment to it, right? Because basically what you're saying is you're losing control of your code base, right? So right now we're talking about this vibe coding as something that is kind of negative, right? But the other thing that I think about is, what if this is just another level or layer of abstraction? Think about infrastructure as code, right? Infrastructure as code and the progression over time. We started with writing infrastructure as code with CloudFormation, right? Thousands of lines these days to deploy a simple solution, right? Because this was designed back in the days for very simple stuff. Now, if you want to deploy something that is reasonably complex, it's going to be thousands of lines of code of CloudFormation templates, right? Which is why we introduced CDK. You can do similar things using maybe hundreds lines of code, right? So what if this is just another layer of abstraction where you can just say, create a CD program that does X, Y, Z? This is very simplistic, right? I'm not suggesting this is the case, but it's basically, the way that I think about this is, what are you committing into GitHub, right? You used to commit this into GitHub, and then you committed this into GitHub. Today, you're not committing an English statement in GitHub so that in the pipeline, basically the pipeline will create the code for you. This is not happening today, right? But it is very likely that this is going to happen at some point in the future, okay? So I kind of starting to change my mind a little bit where, of course, developers are not going to disappear, but in my opinion, the work that developers do will change dramatically, right? And if you think about that, if you step back a little bit, if you think about industry transitions over time, this has happened over the years, right? You used to do agriculture in a certain way, and today you do it in a very different way, right? Or maybe you were doing this, 30 years ago, and today you are programming telepaths, right? Or whatever. So things change, right? And your job may change, but that doesn't mean that the economy will need less people, right? That is kind of how I think about this. And this is the last slide, and then I'm done because I think that we're over. But I like this notion of the bicycle for the mind. I'm not sure how many of you heard Steve Jobs talking about this, but basically this is the idea of an interview that he did where he was talking about the efficiency of the animals on Earth to move from point A to point B. And he read this study that says, in order to move from point A to point B, the most efficient animal on Earth is the condor, okay? And the human being sits like in the middle of that ranking, right? But then he said that he read another article where someone said, what if we give the bicycle to the developer? I'm sorry, to the human being. The human being with a bicycle blew away the condor because it became the most efficient person or animals on Earth, right? And he was talking about this in the context of what the PC does for the human being, right? He was talking about the PC being the bicycle for the human being, right? And I think about this generative AI assistant and generative AI in general as kind of the bicycle for the developer, right? You become a lot more efficient in doing those things. With this, I'm done over time. Sorry about that. As Monica said, this is the QR code for providing feedback because we want this to be useful to you and not just like a rant in the void. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Massimo. I'm really sorry, but